Hello and welcome to Just One More Watch. What would you say if I told you there was a watch you could buy that was technically just as capable as the Submariner from a brand that was every bit as prestigious as Rolex, but would cost you just over half the price of a Rolex Submariner? You'd probably say, yeah, Jody, we know all this already. It's an Omega SMP 300, but we still want the Submariner regardless. Such is the madness of the watch market at the moment, such is the cult that has built up around Rolex as a brand over the last 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 years. However, thankfully there are still people who are not members of that cult for one reason or another. One of whom is Kevin the Scotsman. I first met Kevin the Scotsman last year. He sold me my Doxa 200 sub. Two Scotsmen haggling over price. We were there for a while, let's put it that way. He got back in touch with me at the beginning of this year to say he was expecting to take delivery of a brand new Omega SMP 300 from his fiancee. Would I be interested in reviewing it? And Omega as an engagement present, where have I heard that one before? I'm not suggesting that I invented that particular trend, but it's great to see it being continued. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know what to do. If you like it, you need to put a watch on it. Anyway, to celebrate the fact that Kevin got engaged and loaned me his beautiful Omega for a week, I thought I'd do something a little bit different today. I'm going to flip the camera and do a really brief review, maybe 5 minutes, technical specifications and a nice bit of macro as well. Then I'm going to come back to the studio and give you 5 reasons why you should buy the Seamaster rather than the Submariner and 5 reasons why you should buy the Rolex rather than the Omega. Let's get on with it. I could easily have made one of those reasons the packaging. Rolex gave you a crappy green plastic box. Omega gives you all of this magnificence. Real wood, lovely inlay, proper metal button on the front, but let's be honest, it's going to end up in a cupboard, so I won't focus on the packaging. I will instead focus on the watch. And that watch is a handsome full-size diver. They added 1mm, of course, rather famously to the Rolex Submariner in 2020. Well, they added 1mm to the Omega Seamaster in 2018 when they released this particular model. It went up from 41 to 42mm in diameter. I measure it at just under 14mm thick, 50mm lug to lug, which sounds like a lot, but it isn't because the bracelet drops straight away from those lug tips. 20mm lug width, no taper at all on the bracelet, so it's 20 all the way, back up to 21 at the clasp. Now, it's sized up for Kevin. Admittedly, I would probably need to add one more full-size link to this. It weighs in at just over 180 grams, so full-sized and fully weighted, this one as well. All stainless steel case, crown, bezel and full stainless steel bracelet. We of course have solid end links, solid links, they are screw links, and I'll show you the bracelet in a second. Nice complexity of finish and nice complexity of construction there also. We have a proper milled clasp, fold over, and we have a diver's extension and adjustability. Now I'll pop out the diver's extension, there we are, you can see what that looks like. I'll slot it back in, and if I push that bit that handily says push, I can adjust this one in and out. So glide lock, not the sole purvey of Rolex. Omega has their own adjustable clasp system now as well. It used to be an option on the previous Seamaster, it's now an inclusion on this one. The standard of finishing is high, as you would expect on a watch that costs this amount of money. Mostly brush, super fine brush to the mid case. Check out the scallop finish on that bezel. Very, very nice indeed. Now you do have a couple of polished surfaces. Polished surface to the crown guards there, kind of semi-guarded crown, relatively small crown, Omega branded. It's always been quite a small crown on the Seamasters. We also have a high polished edge broadening actually on that upper lug surface as it runs towards the end. Now, double domed sapphire crystal. You can see a little bit of curvature there. You can also see that that ceramic bezel insert also curves towards the outer edges, meaning the whole thing sits nice and flush, and it is going to slip neatly under a cuff, as they say. And that bezel is a 120 click unidirectional rotating dive time. The action on it is very nice indeed. Enamel inlay on that ceramic bezel insert as well, kind of vivid white there. Arabics and the markers really do pop. People say that this scallop bezel isn't quite as easy to operate as a coin edge bezel or the equivalent. They're probably right, but for 99% of the people, 99% of the time, it's going to be no problems. Maybe if you're wearing gloves or you've got wet hands, it's not quite as easy to grip, but it's not really a big issue. Perhaps you've already noticed there is a helium escape valve up there at the 10 o'clock. More on that later. Seamaster bracelet recognised as being one of the best in the business. 9-link bracelet with 4 of those links being high polished. Again, just adding a little bit of texture, breaking up the brushed effect. Complementing some of the high polished surfaces on the head of the watch. Now, I suggested this earlier on, straight drop from those bracelet end links. 50mm lug to lug is relatively large for a 42mm diameter watch, but this one, as you'll see when I get it on wrist, wears nicely. Now the clasp, I showed you the inner workings. Omega deep etched there, double triggers and a high polished chamfered edge. It's a good looking clasp from the top and from the bottom. But let's get back to the dial, and you can see the dial quite clearly because the anti-reflective treatment on this piece of crystal is outstanding. Anti-reflective upper coating and anti-reflective lower coating. It almost doesn't look like there's glass covering the dial at all. It is amazing, and it's the same effect on my Omega Aquaterra. Now that means you can see those waves on the wave dial all the more clearly. That is a ceramic dial, laser cut, zirconium oxide. You can even see that they've put the chemical symbol for zirconium oxide underneath the pinion. The white dial model, perhaps not quite as noticeably wavy as the blue one and the black ones tend to be. Kevin actually mentioned that as part of his decision-making process when picking the white dial, black bezel inserted version of this watch. Double baton at 12 applied, single batons at 3 and 9, truncated baton to make way for the date complication down there at 6, beveled edge, no frame around that one, circular applied indexes everywhere else, and they are really tall indexes. Again, you can see them because of the anti-reflective coating. Omega symbol and brand name printed under the double index at 12, Seamaster and Professional, Seamaster being in red, matching just that little bit of red on the tip of the lollipop second hand. Coaxial master chronometer printed in grey along with 300 meters, 1000 feet above the date window at 6, and the handset, another signature of the Seamaster range, skeletonized hands. Now they look almost black on this version, but they're just really dark polished. Also, the indices are dark polished, perhaps not quite as dark as the hands though, and they feature fantastic lume. Two-tone lume, BGW9 I'm guessing on the indices and the hour hand, and C3 the green colour on the minute hand and on the lume pip. 20 minutes later, no problem at all, outstanding lume. Again, you'd expect that for the money though, wouldn't you? And the movement is gorgeous. I'm not going to muck around with Kevin's bracelet. I'll probably pop in a photo or two here. Omega in-house master coaxial 8800 caliber. They launched this one a couple of years ago. 55-hour power reserve, 35 joule bidirectional winding grey anti-shock system, and anti-magnetic up the wazoo, capable of withstanding 15,000 Gauss. Quite when you would put yourself subject to those types of magnetic fields, I'm not sure, but there you are. One thing, the beat rate is slightly reduced. It's 25,200 vibrations per hour, so 7 ticks per second, but that does mean you get a juicy 55-hour power reserve. And I had this one on the time grapher. It was running spot on, bang on, master chronometer certified, 0 seconds per day variance in the flat on its back position. And it wears really nicely indeed. I owned an older version of this watch a couple of years ago, and I think this one wears better, even though it is larger in terms of its dimensions. 50mm lug to lug, no problem at all, thanks to the way they've designed the bracelet. And again, I don't have a problem with the fact that there is no taper at all on this bracelet. I think it would have looked a bit ungainly if they had gone for 22, so I'll accept 20 with no taper and a 21mm clasp as a compromise there. Overhead legibility is excellent thanks to a relatively large dial diameter, relatively small bezel diameter, and the fact that those hands, if not quite black, are certainly dark. They really pop off that white dial, don't they? Outside in natural light, again you get to enjoy that wave dial thanks to the anti-reflective undercoating and top coating of the sapphire crystal. On wrist, looking down my wrist, pretty flat profile of the case, but again thanks to those bracelet end links, it really does hug the wrist nicely. Plus adjustable clasp, you always get a perfect fit with this one. And there's the pocket shot. I must admit I could get quite used to this being a regular occurrence for me, and I'm sure my shorts could as well. But I am going to point out one flaw at this stage, and Kevin told me about it. The clasp, the bracelet clasp doesn't really click in. There you are, I'm pushing it, but no click. You have to get your finger underneath it and click it that way. There you are, you heard the click. He's aware of it, he's going to go back to the shop, and if I were Omega, I'd be swapping that whole thing over for another version. If you own one of these, leave me a comment, let me know if you've had similar issues with the clasp. So, what did you think? A gorgeous looking watch, beautifully finished, fantastic looking movement, and I really appreciate this white and black colorway. So I'm going to start with 5 reasons why you should buy the Seamaster instead of the Submariner. The first being that you can actually buy the Seamaster. I could leave this house now and within 2 hours I could be back sitting here in front of all of you wearing my own Omega Seamaster 300 on my wrist. Now, admittedly, I live in the middle of a big city. I've got 5 or 6 boutiques to pick from, but you get the idea. You could all go on the internet and have one of these on the way to your house within a couple of minutes. You cannot say the same about the Rolex Submariner. We all know the problem of buying a Rolex at the moment, whether they're deliberately restricting production or whether they're at capacity and there's just far more demand than there are watches. You cannot buy a Submariner for love nor money unless, of course, you're prepared to do the dance with your AD. I've heard of shocking practices from Rolex authorized dealers, including withholding warranty cards for 12 months so that you can't flip them at a profit. And we've all heard stories, I'm sure, of, yes sir, if you like that Submariner, perhaps your wife would like a lady date just first. Wink, wink, wink. None of that with Omega. You walk into the boutique and arguably you can negotiate yourself a decent discount, something you have no chance of doing with Rolex. Which brings me neatly onto point number 2, price. Now I'm going to talk in Australian dollars today. I would imagine that the difference between the two watches is comparable whether you're paying Great British pounds, Canadian dollars, Swiss francs or US dollars or whatever. It might not necessarily correlate with exchange rates, but standard of living, average incomes, etc, etc. You get the idea. The Omega Seamaster 300 from Omega Australia, if you walked into one of their boutiques, they would ask for just under $8,000. I'm not sure you get a discount at the boutique, but certainly from an authorized dealer, you could expect around 15, perhaps even 20% off that price. So let's call it $7,000 flat. Rolex, if you walk into a Rolex AD and ask about the price, because they're not going to sell you one on the spot, ask about the price of a date Submariner, $12,900, and you can forget about a discount. That is nearly twice the price of your discounted Omega. Now I appreciate 7,000 Aussie dollars is a lot to spend on a watch, but it's not as much as 12,900 Aussie dollars, is it? But despite the Rolex costing nearly 100% more than the Omega, I argue that the two watches are technically very, very similar. Both of them are 300-meter dive watches, both have adjustable clasps, glide lock system on the Rolex is fantastic, the Omega one not so bad either. However, if you are going to be using this one as an actual dive watch, heaven forbid, the Omega has a diver's extension and a helium escape valve. More on that helium escape valve later. Both have sapphire crystal, both have ceramic bezel inserts, both have fantastic lume. Now when it comes to the movement, Rolex recently upgraded the Submariner in 2020 to a new movement that features a 70-hour power reserve and manages to retain a 4 Hz 28,800 vibrations per hour beat rate. The master chronometer grade movement in the Omega is just as accurate as the one in the Rolex, doesn't quite have the same beat rate, operating at 25.2 and only having a 55-hour power reserve, but it does have a coaxial escapement, which is something that the Rolex movement cannot boast. It also has a massive amount of magnetic resistance, 15,000 Gauss, that is 10 plus times what is required for ISO certification. The two watches really are very, very technically similar, so you're paying just over half the money, but there's no way you're getting anything like half the watch. You're getting something very, very similar. Now the fourth reason why I think you should be buying the Omega, do not underestimate the power of anti-reflective coating. The Omega features anti-reflective coating on the upper and the under surfaces of the sapphire crystal covering the dial. As such, the sapphire crystal covering the dial just about disappears from most angles. It is truly spectacular, especially when combined with those big fat indices and that gorgeous ceramic wave dial. You do not get anti-reflective coating on a Rolex. For whatever reason, they've never done it and they don't do it on their sports models, and yet you're still paying $12,900 for that privilege. Or perhaps that should be the lack of privilege. Omega has undoubtedly the best anti-reflective coating that I have seen on any watch, and it is not to be underestimated. It truly is a spectacular effect and one you just don't get with a roller. And my fifth point is that there is far more variety if you are considering picking up a Seamaster. You don't just have to go for black, no date, or a one with a slightly odd looking green bezel, you can go for a blue with blue ceramic wave dial, black with black ceramic wave dial, and admittedly slightly odd looking grey one, or this fantastic white one with black bezel. I reckon the white and black is the killer combo when it comes to this Seamaster. Also, the white dial does not show up those waves quite as much as the black and the blue dials do. I understand that the wave dial is a signature and always has been, or pretty much always has been, of the Seamaster range, but I think less is more when it comes to waves, which is why the white would be my choice if I was picking up one of these. And you also get a factory rubber strap option. Again, something you don't get with Rolex. You have to buy an Everest or something, but it's never going to be quite as OEM as it is with the Omega. But before you all rush out to your local Omega boutique with credit card in hand, next up I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I think you should still buy the Rolex rather than the Omega. The first is, of course, resale. How could I not talk about resale? Let's go back to the prices I was discussing earlier on. So your Omega has a list price of 8, but you get it for 7. You walk out the shop and it's worth 6.5, maybe 6,250. You wear it for a year, 18 months, and it's worth high 5s. So you've lost maybe $1,500 in a couple of years. The Rolex, if you can actually buy one, which is a bit of a moot point, but if you can actually buy one, you walk out the shop and it's worth maybe $3,000 or $4,000 more than it was when you were inside the shop paying for it. Check this cheeky chappy on a local Australian watch forum trying to flog a no-date Submariner for $17,000. Now that has a list price of just over 12. That bugger's trying to make $5 profit just by virtue of the fact that he was able to buy one when you can. I don't hate him, I pity the person that actually pays 17 grand for the watch. But regardless, resale value, perhaps it's not something you should be considering when you buy a watch, but then again, perhaps it's something you should. You're definitely going to lose money with the Omega, you're definitely going to gain money with the Rolex, but that is not standard. You will lose money on 95% of watches. There is a small group of 5 that will actually make you money, and the Rolex Submariner, like it or not, is one of those. Again, segueing neatly into desirability. You can say what you like about Omega as a brand, and I have a lot of love for Omega as a brand. They're just not as desirable at this point in time as Rolex. The average WIS will look down at your wrist and see a Rolex and know how much you've paid for it and give you a nod of respect for that. Your average non-WIS will look down at your wrist, see a Rolex and go, oh, it's a Rolex. And Rolex are everywhere. I'm a petrol head, I'm a big Formula 1 fan, and Rolex is all over every single Grand Prix circuit, and we watch that Rolex clock tick to 10 past the hour to let us know the cars are about to get racing. Rolex marketing is second to none, and they have marketed themselves as the most desirable brand in the market at the moment. Omega just can't quite compete with that. For my third negative, let's get back to the watch, specifically the helium escape valve. I know it's a bit of a signature of the Omega Seamaster range, but it looks like a wart on your watch that is, for 99.9% of the people, unnecessary. And even if they insist on putting a helium escape valve there, why don't they have one of those nice, smooth, neat, integrated escape valves that's just there when you need it, but not there when you don't? That one is there all the time. Why don't they offer the option of a helium escape valve model and a non-helium escape valve model? I wonder what the sales mix would be if they did. And then there's the design of the two watches overall. The Rolex Submariner first came to life in the 1950s, changed a little bit towards the end of the 50s, but pretty much it's been the same watch for the last 60 years. I think it is a design that has transcended the era of its production and has become absolutely, unquestionably iconic as a consequence. The Omega Seamaster is about 30 years old. This model first aired in 1993, and it is now undoubtedly also a bit of an icon within the world of watches. However, has it transcended the era of its production? I'm not quite so sure. Scallop bezel, those funny looking skeletonized hands, the wave dial, which I appreciate is a signature, but perhaps it's one that should have been left somewhere in the 1990s. You're definitely buying an iconic watch with a Seamaster, but probably you're also buying something that looks a little bit more dated, certainly not as timeless as a Submariner does. And finally, despite the $8,000 Aussie list price, I found 3 quality control niggles with this watch. The clasp, as I mentioned in the review, I wouldn't be happy with that. I know Kevin's not happy with that. I'd have taken that one straight back to the shop a long time ago and I'd have got a full brand new replacement from Omega. I'm sure Kevin will do that and I'm sure Omega will do exactly that for him. The bezel also doesn't line up perfectly. You can see it in the regular shots, you can see it much more in the lume shots, and also while we're on the subject of lume, if I show you this, you can see a little streak of lume on the dial as well under UV light. There's been a little bit of extra lume paint splash on the dial and they haven't cleaned it up properly. Now, I'm not suggesting that quality control issues are the sole purvey of Omega. I looked at a Rolex GMT root beer and it had a number of quality control issues. But at least when you buy a Rolex with quality control issues, you're buying one that has gone up in value since you left the shop and not that has gone down in value since you left the shop, if you see my twisted logic. So there you have it. What do you think? Leave me a comment, let me know your thoughts. Did I make a reasonable case for buying an SMP 300 rather than a Submariner? Or is there only one dive watch for you, that being the Rolex? I really like this watch. I think Kevin's fiance bought very well, particularly getting him this white dial black bezel version. That's the one I would go for if I was going to pick up one of these. Perhaps not quite as in your face as the blue dial and the black dial versions are. Ironic that a white dial watch is less in your face than a black dial watch, but the wave pattern, really, that's the big difference I think between these two, and I much prefer the slightly more subdued wave effect from the white dial. I've always been a bit of an Omega fanboy. I've had Omegas on my wrist pretty much as my main watch since I was 16, and I'm a bit older than 16 now. I've never owned a Rolex, and that is looking increasingly unlikely given the cult that has built up around the brand over the last 5 or 6 years or so. Their prices are just outrageous. Not that I think 7 grand for this one is particularly cheap, especially given the QC concerns. I hope Kevin takes this one back to the shop. I hope the shop are watching this. I hope they look after him. I'm sure they will. Thanks for watching. Thanks to Kevin, and I'll see you all in a future video.